case of Singapore, this notion of selling out is a rather interesting one, because Singapore, unlike a lot of other countries in the world, is a very planned society. So the idea of its ability to retain its oriental or indigenous culture vis-a-vis becoming westernized or losing its heritage is in part due to the way in which the society is planned and organized. Unlike other countries, the embracing of the Western culture and the losing of the indigenous one is far more organic in nature.
So in the case, can one say that as a society, we are losing our cultural identity and values in an organic nature?
Well, I think the short answer is that as far as the races that are living in Singapore, the Chinese, Malay, Indian primarily, the traditional practices are very much part of our culture. So in Chinese medicine, for example, food and medicine can be the same herb. So we take the same herb even on a daily basis as part of our diet. And yet when we're sick, the same herb can be used for curative reasons.
In Singapore, from a very young age, we are institutionalized with notions of retaining our own culture and identity. I mean, from the time that we are in nursery school or kindergarten, we are taught that there are four main ethnic groups in Singapore: the Indians, the Malays, the Chinese, and the Eurasians. And therefore, each culture is distinct, unique, and must be cherished.
And yet when we're sick, the same herb can be used for curative reasons. Of course, dosages may change, but there's such a deep acceptance of this practice that in a way we don't really differentiate where food and medicine divide.
Many in Africa have given up on traditional generic foods for more urbanized, genetically modified, or often Western imported menus. These dietary lifestyles are allegedly responsible for many of South Africa's lifestyle diseases. Has the culture and indigenous knowledge sell out in most African societies imposed by our failure to maintain a balance between imported and traditional values and philosophies?
So I think it's very much part of our cultural sort of makeup that these traditional practices are quite accepted.
But why do most modern-day Africans don't take their cultural identity seriously?
For instance, if you take Singapore 30 years ago, the notion of preserving Singapore's past was not high on the agenda of people here. If you think about Singapore as a nation, it was a colonial entity more than anything else. So even historically, it's always had this engagement with the West and this engagement with the globalized world. And yet it has managed to form a sort of a balance between the binary opposites of East and West.
To most urbanizing African communities, traditional indigenous knowledge systems have been rejected mistakenly for witchcraft or backwardness. In such cases, the alternatives have been modern Western medicine.
By acknowledging that, times change and we need to progress, and, ask any Singaporean youth and they will name you a slew of American or British television shows and other cultural entities. But at the same time, I think Singapore, in terms of its media and in terms of its people, have always been very proactive in trying to adapt these Western values or these globalized ideas to a Singaporean context and making it available to people of all races, which is, once again, something unique about the landscape of Singapore.
Environment. Singapore is a very modern society. We look towards all the latest things that's happening. We want to be in the forefront of scientific knowledge and so on. And yet, people find time to look back at their roots and take comfort in this traditional, if you like, practice.
Is this a case of traditional knowledge sell-out or complete lack of trust in African indigenous knowledge and value systems?
You can say that the traditional practices are old, yet I think they fit very well into the sort of modern context.
Have most African societies then failed to reconcile tradition with modernity? How do most African youth feel about tradition, history, or culture? How traditional are African youth lifestyles, say in music, fashion, literature, or values in general?
My opinion as a history student, I would say that from the perspective of youth in Singapore, this balance between history and modernity is shaped through education actually, because from a very young age, in primary school we are taught social studies in which, Singapore is placed in the historical concept of its past, where it began and where it is today. And I think youth today are therefore constantly reminded that where we come from and where we originate from as a people, and how they are also reminded not to forget this past in spite of looking forward to bigger and, dare I say, better things.
Maybe we need to look into our very Eurocentric educational systems, our failure to adapt these educational systems into our indigenous knowledge systems, like the use of our mother tongues as a linguistic and educational medium.
Originate from as a people, and how they are also reminded not to forget this past in spite of looking forward to bigger and, dare I say, better things. So I think in comparison with, for example, its regional partners in Vietnam, in Malaysia, Indonesia, for example. I think there might be a difference in terms of direct engagement with history.
How positive or negative has the role of history been in the preservation or sellout of our African cultures and values?
Because why look to the past when we should be looking to the future? But it is only now in the 20th, it's only now in the 21st century that there is sort of people are able to step back and realize from a sort of helicopter point of view that without history, this means nothing. We are shallow, we are inadequate without a rich ethnic identity, without a rich historical
societal norms
background
have
to buffer
obviously
us.
been determined largely by our history. We were a British colony for over 100 years, and we've been independent for 40-something years. So a lot of our systems and everything have been passed down from the British days. So in terms of our healthcare, for example, so a lot of this is still very much based on the colonial, on our colonial forefathers. We're used to the British way of regulating the healthcare and so on, and our doctors are trained originally under the British system.
Because, you know, if people come to Singapore and all you tell them is how we've got the latest, you know, we invented the USB stick or we have the latest biotechnology. So what? I mean, how does that make Singapore special or unique? It does seem that Singapore has sold out, but now I would say the past 10 to 20 years, suddenly there has been a bit of stepping back and looking retrospectively that there is something of value to keep and there is a necessity to retain the past.
How does the traditional practice live in such a framework? So this is something that in the past, I would say the traditional practices were largely ignored, and it's only in recent years that there has been a regulatory framework for us in order to make traditional healthcare part of the overall system.
So, should we blame the African culture and indigenous knowledge and value system sellout on colonialism? You bet.
Now things, oh my gosh, we have almost forgotten our past. Let's now actively go back. That is why if you look at museums in Singapore, you look at the heritage industry in general, it is a very youthful industry. If you were to look at, I would say go to one of the museums, very rarely would you find anybody over the age of 35 working at high levels. Most of the curators in Singapore are under the age of 40. I can almost guarantee you that, because it is with this new generation, this post-baby boomers, the Millennial Generation as it's called, that there is active regard for the past and a way of integrating the past.
If colonialism was the only reason for the sellout, why do we see this sellout manifest in countries like Ethiopia that were never colonized? But what are the causes of this sellout in Africa? This sellout in Africa.
You know, during the period of colonization, you know, I mean, you have been, you were, the way that, say for example, the British colonized Africa is very different from the way that the British colonized Singapore or Southeast Asia. The extent to which the colonial elites in Britain basically took natural resources from Africa or even from India and did not empower the people, as opposed to the way in which there was a lot more empowerment of people during the colonial period in Singapore, has made the transition from so-called indigenous life to modern life very much smoother for Singapore.
In fact, despite their 21st century lifestyles, a colonial past, they have incorporated or, at times totally, preserved a lot of their traditional knowledge systems, values, and traditions.
The issue of whether we are selling out our heritage, for the sake of modernity and so on. In the Singapore context, I believe we've not done so, because I think there is still a very great regard for what our forefathers have taught us. Partly, I think this is cultural, because I think that the Asian cultures, especially those that are rooted in Confucianism, still have a very strong regard for the past. So we tend to listen to what our seniors tell us, and therefore we accept that what has been passed down from our forefathers has got some value, and we're supposed to respect it.
While we cannot argue that most African societies have entirely sold out their traditional cultural values, the rate at which they are selling out is alarming.
Africa to China, it was just a start off. So while Singapore was of great importance, it was important actually for the British to have a society that was intellectually and socially developed to deal with trade.
So I think in the everyday context, my mother tells me to drink this soup because it's good for me. I accept that, and then and I will also pass that on to my children. I say, look, this soup is good for you. It's good for boosting your immunity or whatever it is, or maybe make you a better student. These are sort of things that your mothers would tell us, and we accept it. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to ignore what modern science has given us either.
Concern. They were put aside, land was reserved for them, and they were left in their primitive sort of cultural, agricultural, farming, fishing sort of lifestyle. They were left alone, but the main engines, the main drivers of the economy of Singapore were the immigrants.
As a country, in Singapore, we don't have very much of our own unique identity. The country comprises of immigrants, immigrant races, and so we've brought our own cultures with us. And in a way, as we try to seek for a Singapore identity, a Singapore culture, until we're old enough as a country to have one, we still look back to our own respective cultures. And I suppose as a Chinese, I'm looking back at the Chinese culture, Chinese traditions, for to give me that sort of comfort and context of where I am, who I am.
Japan and Korea are culturally homogenous, pretty much. They're all Japanese, they're all Korean. So in terms of identity, they have one long historical identity. If you come to Singapore and Malaysia, for example, you will find that you have an eclectic mix of various races and various cultures over the years. So what is a Singaporean historical identity that is still very complex, that is still yet to be uncovered? The museums will give you one version of what it is, and for the most part it is a pretty comprehensive view of Singapore's past.
And I think Singapore as a society still is in this phase of evolution, that we still don't have an entirely unique Singapore culture yet.
It seems that African societies are also facing a cultural evolution. A revolution that has come with rapid urbanization, economic growth, and with it, Westernization.
I think now youth today are actually very interested in looking at the other side, or the unrepresented dynamics, to study the subalterns of Singapore society, things that are not discussed in the grand narrative of what is Singapore's past. I think that is where the subtle difference is. 20 years ago, they would accept the grand narrative for the most part. Youth today are not as accepting of this grand narrative of what Singapore was.
To the rest of the world too. Why can't we have a Starbucks or a McDonald's that comes from Asia or Africa? This is also an opportunity. As people get used to tasting food from many other countries, does it have to be just hamburgers? Why can't it be something else from another part of the world? Again, we're very much fixated, I think, with this colonial mindset. It was the Western colonial masters that imposed a lot of their sort of standards and their products on us in the past. Now, we should react against that. We should say, look, let's turn that around and say this is also an opportunity. We've now got modern technology to help us. We've got all the logistics, the networks, transportation, and so on. Why can't we make use of that same system which brought McDonald's to the neighborhood? Why can't we use that and bring an Asian or an African equivalent to a street corner in a small town in the USA or Europe? So I think this should be seen as an opportunity.
But how does Africa insulate her indigenous knowledge systems and values against global connectedness of business, social media, Hollywood, Bollywood, all Eurocentric cultures, since she's becoming a bigger global player?
Now, efforts are made to come up with an identity that is Singaporean. There are far more films that are made looking at Singaporean lifestyle and looking to represent the Singaporean context. 10 years ago, most of the films that were made might have been made in Singapore, but were completely Western in the manner of speaking, in the context, in the issues that were being discussed. They were completely Western. Today, there is very, very active efforts on the part of young filmmakers today to look at Singapore for what it truly is, looking at its, the fissures in its society as well as the successes in its society, to understand what makes its identity very unique from its neighbours. Singapore is completely unique from its neighbours in the manner which its society has functioned, in the government, in the way in which Singapore is a very well planned and very well organised society. Into Singapore's cultural history to understand what makes people Singaporean, what makes who we are today. Exactly what makes us, not what we are told makes us.
So we say, okay, like, we have to look at modern medicine for certain diseases and so on, but it doesn't it doesn't cause a conflict because somehow it's embedded into our sort of subconscious, if you like, that something that's traditional is quite accepted, something modern, we have to make use of as well. So I think that in a way, there's no selling out entirely to just modern science.
Thank you.